Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good morning, good day to those who join us online today. Good morning to you in the room here at beautiful Villa Moigné. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Felix Kirchmeier. I'm director of the Geneva Human Rights Platform, and I'm your moderator for the next hour and a half. Welcome to this human rights conversation discussing about the ways to onboard business towards a help desk for business on the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. This human rights conversation is co-organized with the Brazilian network of the UN Global Compact. Human rights conversations as a series are events hosted by the Geneva Human Rights Platform aimed at discussing contemporary issues and challenges related to the promotion and protection of human rights in Geneva and beyond. And this is a public meeting. It is being recorded also for access to those who, due to time difference or also other commitments, could not join us live today. So this conversation will be made available online on our YouTube channels of, I think, the Global Compact and ourselves. First of all, let me thank our partners of the Global Compact Network Brazil. And we have Taina with us here on the podium, who is also a speaker. So thank you very much for bringing about this collaboration. And thank you also, Rafael Benke from Proactiva, for also starting us into that cooperation and making the links, actually. I will present the speakers only very briefly because you all have your smartphones and you can look up CVs if you want to. Yeah. Indeed, we want to hear from them instead of telling me who they are. But let me just say I'm delighted to have with me here Rafael Benke from Proactiva, who will be speaking also about the project of the Human Rights Thermometer. Gerald Pachou, who is working with Pluto Consulting, but also who is a research associate here at the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. Isabel Ebert is today with us online. She's a researcher at the University of St. Gallen, but also works at the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in the business team. Then to my left, Taina Leite is Human Rights, Labor and Gender Senior Manager at UN Global Compact Network Brazil. And Lisiane Lemos, to my right, is a board member and founder of Conselheira 101. So you'll tell us, I think, also more about that in a minute. The idea and the format of our discussion today is really to have a conversation. So I'll just get us quickly started into the topic, and then we'll have two rounds of question and answer with the panel, and then open to all of you. For those online with us, we are in a webinar setting, so please do send your questions via the chat. My colleagues are monitoring the chat and will bring those questions also then to the speakers in the third round, which will be the round of the open discussion with all the participants. But I think most of you have attended the 2022 UN Forum on Business and Human Rights earlier this week. I think the forum officially it's 3 days, then lots of side events oscillating around. And of course, we also tag on to that, making use of your presence here in Geneva. Some of you also online have been in Geneva, will be back quickly and are with us again in Geneva, but online. So it's great to have everybody here. The forum addressed the question of accountability. But to reach accountability, businesses have to take a certain number of steps, including self-awareness and problem identification. They may also need specific guidance on the implementation and interpretation of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights in a particular context or particular environment. There is, of course, a lot of guidance around, developed by consultancies, companies, national, regional initiatives, and we will hear about some of them today. But then also the roadmap for implementing the UN guiding principles launched for the 10th anniversary of the UN guiding principles by the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights recommended the establishment of a global UNGP Helpdesk hosted by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and tasked with the development of authoritative guidance for business in interpreting and implementing the UNGPs. Its role would be complementary to the existing company-led national or regional initiatives I just referred to. The momentum around the range of existing and pending legislative measures at national, regional, and international levels on business and human rights offers, I think, for us today a critical opportunity to reflect on the development of such authoritative guidance. As I said, we'll start with 2 rounds of questions to the panelists and then get into an open discussion. And if I can start, actually, Taina, also as your co-organizer in Lisiane, then with you. If you can just give us a first look into what do we know about the UNGP uptake by business. So I think, of course, your examples might come from the Brazilian context, but also if you want more globally, where do you see us stand right now?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Felix. Thank you all for coming today in this very nice morning. Well, first of all, it is a pleasure to share this panel with such a great experts on the matter. For us in Brazil, and going directly to the question, because I think we will benefit from the discussions later. I think it's important just to differentiate the levels where the discussion is in the business, outside the business, and in different companies from Brazil. So one of the things that we saw in our work with Proactiva in the thermometer, but I must say that like the fever is something that you measure with the thermometer, but you feel it also when you put your hand and work with businesses. We don't have many companies or even the general population knowing about the UNGPs at all, to be quite frank. So in Global Compact, we work a lot, for instance, with the SDGs, right? And this is an agenda that the society has already comprehended and knows what it is and what are the SDGs. But many of these same people doesn't know about UNGPs. They don't know they exist. They don't know what they are. And another challenge, even more deeper, is that the whole topic of human rights, especially in Latin America, but in Brazil mostly, is considered something very far from the business sector. So we have a long way to go. And I think this is very important to point when we are in discussions outside, abroad, with the European colleagues or US colleagues or from the global north, that we need to, give a step back and understand that, first of all, we need to reappropriate the concept of human rights. Then we need to say that human rights are related to businesses. And then we need to say we already have a 10-year document from the UN that gives you the guidance and what you need to know and what you need to do. And then we need to help them and support them. So in Brazil, I think we are in this first step of publicizing more and more to the private sector that there is this comprehensive guidance and that they need to implement it.
Excellent. So there's quite a way to go still also, I see. And maybe if I can turn to you, Lysiane, because you're working in the Brazilian context, but you also work with big international corporations. Maybe would you also say, is there such a difference between that context and what you see in the global north?
Yeah, I think there's some need. So first of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm Lysiane Lemos. I'm a business manager, content creator, and MBA professor for tech and innovation. So part of it is to see the UNGPs as an innovation part. So having boards and an entrance, having a translation. So it's important to have Latin America has different maturity level between companies. So we have a lot of multinational companies that bring all this knowledge from Europe, US, and other countries. But also you have Brazilian companies. So having a huge country with a lot of companies, different cultures, and having this direction to the UNGPs, I think it's a challenge. We were talking, Rafael and I, prior to this conversation, that we need translators like I, because my career for the last 10 years is in the corporate environment. And now to talk about this academic level, how can we connect this? Mm-hmm. Because when this week we've been hearing a lot that human rights and labor rights are the same. And it's, I think, the first time in 10 years that I've listened to that. So I think it would be important to have these board members, such as Rachel and Fernanda that we have here, having this knowledge on how can we leverage the human rights word and knowledge to these environments, to the corporate environment. So having examples, we were talking about also that when we talk about human rights in Brazil and Latin America, so because now we work with 6 different countries, people only think about slavery. And today, celebrating the Global Day of Abolition of Slavery, it's important to think human rights and other things, as having Black women in leadership, as having access to economic and development, to have education, because if you don't know, Black people did not have access to education like 200 years ago. So I think talking about the thermometer will be a tool to make companies understand this new language, but still we need people challenging the system, translating into it, and making alliance as we are doing in this event.
Okay, thank you very much. And actually, if I can just open it quickly to all of my panelists, including, of course, Isabel online. In some words, where would you see? So you mentioned lots of companies think of slavery, but you already mentioned other points that they need to look at. What do companies look at, and actually, are they looking for guidance on the right topics? Or what is your experience? Everybody could go for an hour on that, I guess. But just if I could ask you for some pointers to that, Gerald, can I start with you?
Yes, thank you, and bon dia, I guess.
Yes.
So, that's it. I get everything. Now, as you mentioned, we did this research in support of the work of the working group from the academy, looking at capacity building and what companies are looking for, and it's almost impossible to answer the question because it's very context dependent, and in different countries you have different issues. One thing that we see a lot, and that was mentioned, is a bit of confusion with the alphabet soup. Is it BHR? Is it ESG? Is it SDG? And so sometimes people don't know, companies, but others also don't really know where to situate themselves. Still, we see a lot of questions related to labor rights, and still today for a lot of companies, the human rights scope is restricted to labor rights, or even worse, in a way, to child labor. That's the universe of human rights for so many companies, and well, Brazil being a case in point. A lot of companies think that it's just labor, child labor, but we see a lot of different questions, and we see a lot of different responses. So the ecosystem is extremely diversified.
But you were nodding on the child labor, but so
yes, no, I think first of all, thank you also for the invitation for setting up this fantastic event and this distinguished panel, and also fantastic public of people that are really engaged in the subject. So it's a great opportunity. I think it's really extraordinary that we can have this kind of panelists at the table, particularly you, Lisiane, with all your corporate experience, because we're talking about business and human rights, right? And this link between both maybe is one of the biggest gaps, right? Business is run and its own universe. How do we insert and really do what is our challenge, which is to integrate the due diligence of human rights into the corporate world? And I think everything we heard now from Gerald, from Taina, Lisiane, points into this direction. There is this huge gap of understanding. And we are not talking here, if we want to, 10 years after the UNGP statement, if we want really to have business and human rights considered at a strategic level, it will not be just through a satellite work that will make it happen. So the kind of words that Lisiane was just using, considering business and human rights as an innovation item in the corporation, consider business and human rights as a new culture that needs to be developed, not a new culture that will deal with within the fringes of the organization, but how do we insert that in the DNA? So if we want to do that, how can we start if in a conversation with the company, we have the type of answers we got from Lisiane and Gerald just explained? Do you have an issue with human rights? Are you integrating human rights in your corporation? The answer is no, we don't have slave labor or child labor. So this is how I think, and first of all, this is, I think, one of our biggest challenges, right? To start with leveling the playing field of understanding. If we don't start from the same point, how can we get anywhere, right? And I think this is the inspiration. I think we will hear from Tainá. And this is the inspiration for a track, right? So we want to onboard a track that can guide us to a better understanding, better performance.
Right. And also coming to you, Isabel, online with us today. So you are working with OHCHR in particular on the BTech project business, the technology business. So, and also Gerald said it before, depending the area, the domain you're in, the questions are different ones. But what are the main human rights issues that you see there, and where guidance is sought by companies?
Yeah, thanks, Felix, and thanks for the opportunity to join you virtually. I'm really sorry I can't be there in person. I would have loved to see you all. With regard to manufacturing, I certainly agree that modern slavery, forced labor, and also child labor are usually the first that come to mind, also partly due to the fact that we have a lot of regulation specifically on these issues. Interestingly, when it comes to the tech sector, and you might have heard the panel during the forum this week where we had the South African telecommunications company MTN joining. In tech, it's a lot around, on the one hand, dealing with host governments or home governments, depending on the jurisdiction, that put companies in very difficult situations, in particular when it comes, for example, to network shutdowns, with all the repercussions that the cutting off of the internet can have on many human rights. But there's been really significant worry in the tech community about authoritarian governments most of the time cutting off the internet in order to prolong their reign of power, so to speak. The other two issues, the classic ones in the tech sector, are privacy issues due to sort of data maximization business models, and on the other hand, freedom of expression. When it comes to content governance, we have seen many examples around how also the interpretation of freedom of expression can be in tension with combating hate speech and then the incitement of violence that has happened on social media platforms. And we've seen that again and again, sadly, in Myanmar, but also Ethiopia and many other countries.
Thank you very much. Yes, you speak on the state side, of course, there are a lot, and on the big tech corporations. Now, also, again, bringing it back to that multitude of companies out there and the different needs they might have. Raphael, if I can turn to you. So you have developed, Tainá mentioned that already, the human rights thermometer. You have also run it, you're piloting it. It might be something that I understand can become also a continued feature for businesses. If you could give us an insight of how actually can that tool that you developed help companies find all the right issues that are related to them individually and directly?
Definitely. And I think it's interesting to hear Isabel's speech and see how much certain sectors are related to certain issues. And this is exactly what is not sufficient, right? Because we just heard from the forum, let's put rights holders at the center. So when are we going really to have a robust due diligence in human rights and really understand what rights are in risk or being impacted by business, and then how do we work on that? So I think the idea of the thermometer was exactly to help companies not to do its due diligence, not to do a diagnosis, not to have anything final. The idea is to raise the awareness. So we wanted a tool based on what we would do or use for gap analysis, for a human rights risk mapping or human rights impact assessment, roughly, right? And in a very quick way, right? That would allow these companies to have a certain idea about what it means for my management, what it means for my operations, what it means for my supply chain, right? So that they could grasp a little better what is the agenda of business and human rights beyond the stereotype, right? So, and the idea, and just to explain why we have a human rights strap on your screen, is that the idea was, let's not only take this picture of the moment where you are at now, and that we review a bit of your maturity through a self-assessment. But let's have that as our baseline. Let's have that as our starting point so that we develop our tools and systems and capacity building and action to try to perform better year after year. So we'll show a slide here just to show what kind of information the tool provides us with. So we had, in this exercise, we were very happily impressed that we have over 100 companies, 107 companies to be more exact, participating in this effort, which is voluntary with the UN Global Compact Network in Brazil. So here you have, for instance, interesting data. What is it saying here? First of all, on the left, you see that about 90% of the companies, they have some sort of human rights related commitment, right? But as Isabel was saying, a lot of these commitments are connected to legislation, let's say labor legislation. So this is why the score is so high. But when we move into the specifics, how many of these companies really have a specific human rights policy? We have just 1/4 of these companies with a specific human rights policy. And these are companies that are engaged in sustainability. They are part of the UN Global Compact. They are acquainted with sustainability. And just 1/4 of them have a policy. If we go further to the right, it's interesting that those that have this policy, only half of them really make reference to international human rights charters. So we also have an issue there in terms of the quality of policies that are being developed. So what is the idea here? We have a baseline. We understand where we are at and what we have to develop, right? And then very quickly, moving forward, we give the example of issues. And here, Isabel, what we were trying to do, this is not definitive. These are some salient issues for Brazil that we enable through the tool so that we could get a bit of a maturity idea of how companies are treating. So each one of these issues through the tool will have maybe half a dozen questions, right? And through that, we can see the level of maturity. So see that on the top left, the number one issue, it's very small, maybe you're not seeing, but I'm going to read for you.
Yeah, it's better for the people online then.
Exactly. So the number one issue in terms of commitments by companies is equality, diversity, and inclusion, right? That's number one. Almost 100% of the companies that participate in this exercise had some kind of commitment. But then when we move to the average of adherence to really what you're doing concretely and delivering, we see that roughly 60% of them are really with a higher maturity in terms of D&I and inequality. So you see that it falls a lot. And to Isabel's point again, we see that number one is environment, right? A lot of prescriptive legislation already asking companies to do things about it. Health and safety, forced labor, right? And the final comment, how much companies are looking at suppliers. So we see that suppliers still much less seen. And then a final slide just to give you an interesting idea about how human rights risks are being identified and assessed by companies. So the percentage of companies that have structured procedures, right? And these are companies, again, that are engaged, only 60%. You can say, well, very good, 60 have already, right? And we have to see the quality of it. But anyway, 40% don't have any sort of identification and assessment of human rights risks. And we see on the right that this decreases the farther the risk is from the normal risk management of the company. So I do a lot of it for my operations. If I go to my supply chains, less players do that. And if I talk about clients and final consumers, even less. So I think that exemplifies very well. We spoke already about the issues. I don't want to go to that. And I just want to make one final point, and maybe Tainá can then later complement. A very relevant topic. We are just after COP27, just transition, and we brought the human rights component of climate change to the thermometer. So, and we are asking companies, first of all, how many of them knew were engaged at all with discussion of just transition, and we see that from these participants, a minority really is engaged in this theme. But I wanted to raise your attention to the right graphic, where you have the companies that really include the human rights dimension in their risk identification for climate change, right? And we see that the 36% of these companies consider the effects that climate change could have on the risk and impacts on human rights. So only 36 of them, which can be good and bad, but it's an interesting number for us, right, in this connection. And 24% do not consider these effects. So I think this type of figures and data is what the thermometer will allow us to do the analysis, and with this baseline, we try to progress year after year through a track.
Thank you very much, Rafael. And so I need to go very quickly also through that, because we need to stay in that conversation format. But of course, I think we'll make also the report of your work available, I think, to the online participants and also to participants in the room. When you first spoke to me about that tool, I thought it was also of particular interest because, well, it gives companies, as you say, the possibility to get self-awareness, self-assessment. But what I think you mentioned also then was that possibility to look at them over time. See what the impact of the legislation you mentioned can be actually on their compliance with the UNGPs down the line in a couple of years. So I think once you're in that project also for some years and you can see the development of those percentages, I think that will be very interesting also seeing what kind of external factors might contribute to what kind of development. But speaking of that bigger landscape, also, Gerald, if I can come back to you, because that's also part of the research that you did last year at the Academy. So once there is a self-awareness of companies, they might turn to consultancies, they might set up a human rights team, but they might also need a certain level of guidance on the international standards in particular. What is the landscape that you found out there, and what are maybe also then taking from that the gaps in that landscape?
Yes, thank you. I think that we see a lot of initiatives, and what we just discussed is the perfect example. But in terms of actual guidance, we see a huge gap because there are a lot of organizations working on the issue, but not a lot of clear access points. If I'm a company or if I'm civil society having a specific issue, where do I go? And that's definitely one of the big gaps that we saw. We know that the ILO, for instance, has a help desk for the issues covered by the ILO. The German government has established a help desk for German companies. And we see, and I'm sure that there are many other initiatives like that, but we don't have a clear access point. And in that context, I think it's important to underline the fact that and it goes to the title of today's event. Helpdesk is an interesting description, an interesting idea. But actually, what is needed is broader than that, because a helpdesk comes with some advantages, but also some disadvantages. For instance, what we saw from the existing helpdesk is their capacity to absorb a lot of questions. We think that, we'll have a help desk, so we'll have the answer. Well, the help desk has to have the capacity to answer in terms of staff, of human resources, but also in terms of political encourage. For instance, it's extremely difficult for UN organization, and we have seen that many times, to be very explicit about challenges in a given country. So that would be a limitation if we think only about the help desk. And that's one of the reasons why the roadmap, the research we did, fed into the roadmap. And Dante is here and he can talk more about that. But that's one of the reasons why in the roadmap for the next 10 years, that the working group was careful to highlight the usefulness of a help desk, but also to look beyond that and to look at capacity building writ large. Because otherwise we might end up with a wrong good idea. Oh, we have a help desk. Yeah, but if the help desk takes 6 months to respond to a question and then says, oh, we can't really respond, then, it's a bit of a shortcoming. So that's why I think that when we look at those issues based on the research we did, we need to look beyond and more broadly at what it means for capacity building. For instance, one thing that we see clearly missing for business, but also for civil society, is this idea of a safe space where discussions can take place. A help desk, narrowly defined, won't provide you that. And yet, that's one of the most important things that we need today. Training is also something that we need urgently. And so that's why we need to think a bit more broadly. The example of your tool or of your initiative is also a very good example, because another thing that we see missing is how do we move from the region, the country, the precise experience to the global level to then go back to a specific country. It would be great if your tool and the lessons that you have learned developing the tool could be brought to the attention of a much wider community. That's capacity building. That's helping. Yeah. But there are no places at the moment where that can take place. So that's why, the roadmap and when you think about this capacity building measures, we need to look really beyond simply a help desk, because otherwise we will be, to be blunt, we will be disappointed. Because I can't imagine a help desk, the UN system, to be honest, the UN system struggles to provide human rights advice to slightly less than 200 states. How will the same system provide quick responses to thousands and thousands of companies? So that's why we need to be a bit creative and look more broadly at what the roadmap suggests, which is to establish something. Felix, you want to cut me off? I'll make just one more point, because when we look at helping respect for human rights by companies, we focus a lot on pillar 2, corporate responsibility to respect, but capacity needs to be developed on the whole 3 pillars of the guiding principles. I don't believe personally the theme that, the forgotten pillar is remedy. I don't think so. But still, we need to focus attention on states. If you go to most government today and you want to have a serious discussion on business and human rights, it will be tough. So capacity needs to be developed there, and of course on remedy and accountability. So really, we need this shift from pillar 2 to back to the guiding principles, because the guiding principles are all a very interesting a system that relies on all of the pillars. So we need to broaden our horizon, and we need more coordination, because we always think, guiding principles, UN, but we really focused a lot of energy and attention to make sure, for instance, that the guiding principles and the OECD guidelines were one and the same at the end of the day. So we need to bring the OECD as the home, as the father and mother of their own instrument in the discussion, because it makes no sense to do capacity on the OECD guideline and then capacity on the guiding principle. So to have this coordination and cohesion is one of the key elements we need to focus on in the future.
Thank you for bringing us back to the big picture also, because you've been working on the development of the UNGPs from the very start with John Ruggie. So, of course, how could I cut you short in getting us this overall view of where we are? But I think also what you mentioned about the capacity that a global help desk would have. So I think that point, we might come to that in just a minute with Isabel, maybe, because I think that's very interesting also as a question of what kind of guidance, what kind of coordination this instance would have to give, including space for discussion and training, and just not trying to replace all the initiatives that are out there, but to complement them. So maybe it doesn't have to reply to thousands and thousands of companies a day, but it could be another level. And I think there's also, you mentioned Dante Pesce here in the room, there's also other initiatives that also look at other levels of that guidance. So we'll come to that. But first, Taina, you also wanted to complement something on that process, and you might start. So I'll give you the word.
No, I think it's a very interesting what we are hearing, and but I always like to come back to the ground and to remember, for instance, in Brazil, I think I can speak for Latin America in this case, that we are much behind on the discussion, and not only we are talking, for instance, here of a global help desk. But in Brazil, we have, 1% of the population that speaks English. And Portuguese is not an UN official language. So we don't have translation to Portuguese from the UN. And that 80% of our companies in Brazil are small and medium companies. So I really think that we need, as a local network, and that's what we want to do, because if we look to the data Rafael brought, and you are going to receive the complete report just today online, we see that companies that are engaged, because they are in the UN Global Compact, they are doing their homework, still don't have much, because we are looking at a profound gap. So what about all these 80% of SMEs that doesn't even know what UNGPs mean? What are they doing? They don't speak English. They don't know what they have to do in this sense. So it is really important. And I really thank Gerardo for bringing up that big companies understand, one, the impact they have in their supply chain. And that's super important. And I have here our partners in working on with this. Renata is there. Petrobras, we just launched a very important project to leverage capacity and train their supply chain. And we're talking on one of the most biggest companies in Brazil. But also companies need to understand and do their job advocating with governments for the implementation of UNGP. So they have this power, this financial power, this political power, and they, I think, need to step up and influence governments. And we are here to support the private sector, and with technical, with the capacity building, with the, organizing all the things, translating to Portuguese if needed. But still, I don't see how we can discuss anything globally or super coordinated until we come back to the ground and say, look, we have 90% of the jobs in Brazil are from SMEs. People don't speak English. People don't know what this means. And we need to, leverage the world. And I think we cannot create just I'm not him, but I just want to finish one thing, is that we cannot create a bubble, like we have these big companies doing everything beautifully and nice. And then we have the whole reality that doesn't even have a formal job or support for their retirement or, all these other rights that are human rights as well. So I really think it is key that we are here in the global north discussing our challenges in Brazil, in Latin America, and I think in the global south as a whole.
Thank you. Yes, and it actually again speaks to the different levels, to the different ways of guidance necessary on different levels. So if I may turn to you, Isabel. So I think I learned that the most downloaded document on the UN OHCHR website is the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And if I'm not mistaken, they exist in many more than the UN languages. But then how would you see from your discussions at OHCHR this help desk function? Because I would also assume that you are not right away jumping into trying to get all those 80% of SMEs from Brazil sending Portuguese questions to the help desk. So where's this thinking actually in that development?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, first of all, I have to say I was really happy that this initiative for this event also came from Global Compact Brazil, which shows the necessity that we really create this momentum globally. At the same time, Geneva, while being located in the global north, the UN is there as an international organization with all the international representations present, and I think there's two things. On the one hand, it is important that there's this contextual, localized capacity building with as many initiatives from as many actors as possible. At the same time, what we've been witnessing at the moment is that we have this proliferation of initiatives with like different geographical focuses, types of organizations, types of human rights issues, and also sectoral focus, which is sort of a really nice kaleidoscope of measures. But these measures are very much tilted on providing capacity building measures to businesses. So what Gerald also mentioned when it comes to building capacities in civil society organizations, but also states, there's an inherent gap. And at the other hand, with this proliferation has a consequence on potentially the quality and rigor that is applied. So while we on the one hand need to reach out widely, it's also important that we ensure that the way in which the UN Guiding Principles are interpreted globally is consistent and coherent with the expectations that the UN Guiding Principles put out. And that's why also, as you mentioned, we have all these resources available in all the UN working languages, because it's so important to ensure that sort of the OHCHR can act as a guardian for the spirit of the expectations that the UNGPs put out there. And then when we turn to what the roadmap put out, it's really tackling these two fronts, right? On the one hand, this sort of help desk with the OHCHR that can ensure that the way in which the UNGPs are interpreted with the mandate of the OHCHR, which has the legitimacy to do so. And at the same time, this second idea in the UNGPs plus 10 roadmap of a fund or global institutions that could provide this sort of exchange platform in order to ensure that the capacity building measures really reach out in the different contexts and regions and sectors to make them impactful. And it was really fantastic that also this year the German presidency of the G7 picked up on the roadmap recommendations and called on states to commit to using their broad powers across domestic policy areas to implement more ambitious supporting measures. So I think right now, I'm really happy to see that there's such a big traction around this topic, and it will really help us to foster as much business, but also state capacity building measures, hopefully, that then also will capacitate further on civil society organizations through state funding. So I think this is a really crucial moment, and I hope that this momentum today leads to specific results. Of course, it also means that we need states to support these endeavors so that we can ensure that really the help desk is something that serves all member states. And that also brings me to effect with the OECD. Of course, it's important that we cooperate around the OECD guidelines, but the scope and purpose of the OECD is a different one than the one of the OHCHR. I see. Gerard, we can talk about this for hours, and we have. But I think it's important to there's on the one hand the organizational anchoring, and then on the other hand the really contextual, operationalized, impactful work in the region. So just to make sure that we cover this whole spectrum of the lighthouse interpretation, as at the same time the necessity to make sure the measures are picked up in various contexts and in diverse ways.
Thank you very much. And I think helping member states is one of the points that I pick up, but also expectations was a word you used a couple of times. So before throwing the floor discussion open to everybody, if I may again come to the panel also in terms of those expectations. So also, where would you see that global help desk? When would companies turn to that instead of or building on what they have done on the past before? And Lisiane, can start with you maybe on that one.
Yes, I was taking notes here to not forget anything that is related and not to waste our time. But it's important that my corporate business point of view is from a person that worked 6 years in IT support and help desk. So first thing that comes to my mind when you talk about having a global help desk is in a way of tech solutions for non-tech needs. And it can be only a name, but it will be a challenge. Like, how can you make companies do not see that it's a support that have only to take over emergencies? Because in my mind, as I work a long time with that, it's the first thing that comes. So it's way challenging. A person come all over from Brazil and say, see over the name. But I think most tech companies, as the ones that I work, will see that. Second, it's about location. And I agree with Tainá. How can you use technology and social media to expand the discussion? Even with the connection challenge that we have in Latin America, Brazil is top 3 user in WhatsApp and TikTok. So how can we use that to make more people be part of that? How can we leverage this discussion outside of webinars and being where people is? Third point, who will be building the global help desk? Like the movement of people with disabilities, nothing about us without us. How can we support the ones that do not have access, like the 95 of non-English speakers? How can we leverage race, gender, location, education? You have to see like color, you have to see background, you have to see the language of the one who build that. Nowadays, there's one color, one gender, one race, like one economic reality. Then for a global help desk, you have a complex legal system. I'm also an attorney. So in Latin America, we are allowed to ask race, gender, disability, and have exclusive job posting, talking about human rights for gender and race, women in Latin America, and race in Brazil. So how could this help us understand this legal complex system? And as Rafael said, this is a mechanism to make people work with human rights. Mm-hmm. Then last two part about business, how the change management will be done. I'm also a change management practitioner. So you need to bring awareness, qualification, you need to think about implementation and critics, budget, resources, and commitment. So we have a lot of things to think about the solution and how the companies will connect and how can we leverage what we need. See the language that I use to bring all these points. So I think my expectation is that all of us could be able to be in the table discussing with boards, with the corporate leadership in their language, using tools as a thermometer.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, and again, I think you point to the fact of those different levels of where to engage and who engages at what point. And Gerald also brought that up, saying if everybody with every urgency, as you say, with every emergency turns directly to the global system, there is a problem. But I think we have that, of course, not only when we look at the UNGPs, when I look at the UN treaty bodies and states, or then also individuals turning to them, there is a lot of levels until you reach that level of global guidance that you look for. I don't know if the others want to have a quick comment on that also, because then I will also very soon open up. But yes, Rafael.
Yeah, no, very quickly, because I think what Lisiane was just saying connects directly to what Tainá was saying and Gerald. So I just want to establish this link because I think it's very interesting. I believe what the panel is putting forward here is a challenge to the protagonists and the leadership that has been guiding the debate and actions and path for the business and human rights future, right? I think it is necessary for this leadership to do its own assessment of risk in human rights coming from its own activities, right? And I think a major salient human rights risk for the leadership of the business and human rights community is that we don't bring it to scale, right? So I think the big challenge there is how do we mainstream business and human rights? Because we can have our bubble, and as Tainá was saying, working very well for a couple of corporations, or how do we really tackle and amplify that debate? And in that regard, going to Gerald's point, a help desk, and to Lisiane's very pragmatic point on a help desk and what a help desk means for the corporate world. If we have business still restrained to slave labor or child labor, what kind of questions should we expect? What will this help desk be used to? So the first thing we do is to raise this awareness. We need in scale business understanding human rights with another amplified dimension. And I think the example we have from that is what is happening in this initiative sponsored by the Global Compact Network in Brazil. They ran the thermometer in Brazil. Companies participated, and we have here present Petrobras. From their readings, they are going to run the thermometer in 100 of their top suppliers. So this is how we, through supply chains, through mobilization of business, will bring this to scale. Is it perfect? No. Is the thermometer due diligence, integration of due diligence? No. It's a mobilization tool. It's a sensitization tool. We are making companies aware so that they start integrating how business integrates everything and puts things in the DNA of strategy.
No, I just wanted to I think it's really important to complement that from our view, and I think Lizzie was perfect on, maybe we need to be, like the guardian to bring the questions, the right questions, like to collect everything and translate. I really see that UN Global Compact in the whole system, we are kind of this interpreter, like we talk all languages. We speak business language, we speak UN language, we speak academic language. So in the human rights platform that I have the privilege to lead, what we are doing is using all this data, using the UNGPs that I really want our private sector to, knowledge, have all the deep knowledge that they have in the SDGs. Next year, we are going to work on different sectors. So to implement a specific view for specific sectors and also for SMEs. So I really think that the idea of the help desk is really important to maybe support us as the guardians of these actions. And I just wanted to acknowledge the presence of the ambassador of Brazil at the UN, Mr. Tavares. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Yes, and welcome, Excellency. You mentioned already all the people in the room, so I really want to give them a chance to speak. Isabel, a quick return to you also as you requested the floor, and then I'd really like to turn also to the participants here in the room who have been mentioned or quoted, but didn't have the chance to speak by themselves. So Isabel, quickly over to you.
Yeah, just one point on, I think what we're currently seeing, what states are funding, that, and Gerard mentioned this as well, we have several European states in particular running help desk related to their national legislative frameworks. And if we fast forward to 10 years, we might have other jurisdictions also being quite active in this field. And again, here it's this vital importance to ensure that not each of these help desks is then saying something different. And we end up with different recommendations to businesses. And I just want to give one example that popped up a couple of years ago with regard to how the UNGPs apply to minority shareholding. And these are sort of the questions, I think, where we sometimes need to turn back to the OSCE to provide this orientation. But I also want to compliment, of course, the important work that the Global Compact networks are doing globally on translating the UNGPs to specific activities in various contexts. And just thank you again for this initiative today.
Thank you. So with this, I would like to open the floor for your questions and comments. Please do introduce yourself when you take the floor. Keep it short also, so we have a possibility to come back to the panel for reactions. And for those online, again, if you'd like to send in questions via the chat, my colleagues will bring them to our attention. And well, I'm throwing it open, but I'm also tempted to tease out some of your inputs. Specifically, we have a former member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, Mr. Dante Pesce, with us here in the room. Welcome, Dante. And right now, you're also involved in an initiative with the IOE, the Organization of Employers, again, which, if I understand rightly, is a kind of guiding function, but not necessarily to individual companies. So how do you go about that issue that we just discussed so much here on the panel? If you'd like to break the ice, and then really everybody, please do come in with your comments and questions.
Thank you, ladies and everyone else. First of all, it's really refreshing how many comments have been made about the next 10 years of guiding principles of the roadmap. With Gerald, who was part of the team that actually conceptualized it, and put it in practice. With support from the German government, political support first, some financial support later. So that's also very important because it reminds what Germany is doing overall. Chairing in the European context, it's called the name, but it's the Team Europe that is preparing the implementation of the future directive, chaired by Germany, and then the project that I will mention is also supported primarily by Germany. So it said a lot about coherence, consistency. So when you decide to take the lead, you have to do it everywhere, not just in one specific place. Okay, so out of the 10 years, few short comments. One is not forget governance as the basic enabler for respect for human rights, rule of law, a basic condition for respect for human rights, and what we identify in the group, the lack of political will. Mostly from our governments, and that was considered to be the number one obstacle for business and human rights. Is not the appetite of business to do the right thing, it's the lack of appetite of our governments to comply with their obligations. And so that's the first thing. Second thing is that voluntary measures are not enough. They might help, but actually, say what we have seen is the mandatory measures are becoming much more normal and more effective. For example, in the European context, that is happening very clearly. We also mentioned shapers as universities or benchmarks initiatives, like the one that was described, as that can play a good role to facilitate and to provide certain evidence, data, etc. The role of business associations to normalize and to speak business together. And overall, the ecosystem. Without an ecosystem, we're always in isolation. And when we have initiatives and isolation, basically we don't go far. That's the implication. Then I would ask the International Organization of Employers to lead a project against logical normalization. So the first thing is that the association that has presence in 150 countries have decided to embed the recommendations of the working group regarding the next decade of implementation and take the lead, of course, in partnership with many others and trying to create synergies, etc., to take the lead in pushing the guiding principles into practice everywhere. And there are a number of lessons that I will go through in listening from around the world. Companies, especially not so large companies, don't live out of diplomas. They live out of contracts. What are the drivers or the incentives? Are there incentives or not? Most part of business people are not ideologically driven, are very pragmatic. So if there's anything for me or not, beyond complying with law, of course, that will be, let's say. There's another one is how to connect human rights to a competitive advantage. How to connect human rights with trade and commerce. They tend not to trust academics like me, much less government officials or international bureaucrats. So we can play a facilitating role, but they trust their peers.
maximize synergies, avoid duplication, and don't exaggerate in creativity that adds lack of clarity and confusion. Avoid divergence from international standards and stick to them and not reinterpret principles. Speed up and scale up, of course, is key, with less desktop creativity and much more implementation creativity regarding implementation. Another question is training for what? For trainers to tick their box and let's say and report back to the donor, or wearing the shoes and filling practical gaps. And final point is on the 12th of December. Now, this project is going to be presented in public. The High Commissioner will speak. The Secretary General of ILO will speak. And the State Minister or State Secretary of Germany for European Affairs will speak. And of course, it's going to be an official, formal, public commitment by the global employers, Global Business Association, to say we commit to be the normalizers in partnership, collaboration, etc., with everyone else, of course, and in a specific fit to fill this gap that was recognized in the 10 Plus project. So that's what I can share with you.
Thank you very much for giving that additional piece of the puzzle, actually, of the global guidance that we have. Again, I was needing to throw the floor open, so please do just request for the floor here in the room or again online. Who would like to comment, have questions to the panelists?
I just want to make
And sorry, if you could put on the microphone, we are in a beautiful historical building, but the downside of it is actually that the acoustics are not that good.
First of all, thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure. My name is Rachel Maya. I am part of a board member, as Lizzie mentioned, from Brazil Bank and then Vale and others. My comment is really aligned with what Liz said, and then also remind what Taina mentioned. The GDP comes 75% from the small and medium companies. We should remind that always when we brought up any global solution. It's very important to remember that. Yes, I come from the corporate world, and the corporate world has a lot of restriction from the academic. But Anna and I was discussing about how is important this moment that we are discussing human rights for business purpose. Human rights being mentioned in the contract. How should we do that? And then now, in a board member, we should make this be part of the agenda. Is that what we are working very hard, very strong, not just for sustainability, it's nice to have, but human rights be part of the strategic agenda. Is that what I'd like to add? Thank you.
Ambassador, please.
Just profiting from the fact that microphone is right here. I'll take too much of your time. Thank you very much for having me. I saw this beautiful, diverse and gender unbalanced representation of Brazil during the due diligence. I was very proud of it. Unbalanced being more women than men. And, I was very encouraged. My colleague Andrea and I are here at the mission of Brazil, dealing with 28 multilateral issues. But obviously, human rights is one of the key ones. And we're the ones, as an international bureaucrat and a government official, with whatever legitimacy and trust that we merit. But actually, we are dealing with the UN principles every time we come up with a new resolution, like October last, when we agreed to have the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So all of the issues benefit from this beautiful gathering. And I think the beauty of the forum is actually bringing people that are very knowledgeable, but I'm very well impressed and humbled by all of the presence. I have a question for the panel. As we move in Latin America towards, I would say, a more breathable atmosphere politically in human rights, where we will have increasing concern for issues that LGBT, disabilities, mental health, and indigenous populations and xenophobia, racism, and all the issues have been somehow given some attention, but not a priority, not enough. So as we move that, and responding to Taina's concern about language, my question is, what are we able to do in order to follow what Rafael has mentioned in this decanting and allowing more companies to benefit from the discussion of human rights? How can you use in Latin America, but also in what we call CPLP, the Lusophone community, where the language shouldn't be a barrier, although we know that we sometimes don't speak the exact same Portuguese. But how could we benefit, maybe from a micro perspective, but radiating through those countries and using other formations? As diplomats, we are very happy to resurrect what we call the IBSA, India, Brazil, and South Africa, uniting three great democracies. But what platforms can you use, and what advice you give us to help you allow this issue of human rights and business to be not only aired, but also come back to us as we organize our UN principles and work with the help of the civil society towards, the full implementation and respect, and also application of remedies for human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for the question. I will give it to the panel, but I will collect 2-3 more questions because unfortunately we only have time for one round. So just wait for your advice, which you are preparing. Also, company representatives were mentioned before. I know Pedro Blas was mentioned, and for your involved there, if you want to also have some comments.
Yes, say a few words. So my name is Renata. I'm the head of compliance for Petrobras, and we've been doing a very focused work on integrity and ethics. So we already took this step in order to raise the bar regarding our supply chain, because as being one of the biggest companies in Brazil, we understand and recognize the role that we have in order to raise the bar and push up the suppliers for Petrobras to have better practices related to ethics and compliance. So today, when we look at a supplier that has a high risk from Petrobras perspective, this supplier cannot be part of our procurement process. And I believe that now it's the time to do the same for human rights. So that's why I'm here representing and together with fellows from corporate responsibility. And the idea is, with this partnership with UN Global Compact, the idea is to raise awareness in the first step, but looking forward and from a longer perspective, the idea is also to have the same standards and requirements that we have for integrity and ethics. We have to do the same from the human rights perspective. So we really recognize the importance that we have in the Brazilian supply chain and the Brazilian markets. And we recognize the responsibility that we have in order to push the bar and raise this bar and demand more from our suppliers. So we did with ethics and compliance. Now it's the time to do it as well as for human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And very important point, I think, is really also that from ethics to human rights. I think if we look at how those topics were dealt with in companies or are still being dealt with, and I think, again, a lot of the IT and tech sector where community standards and ethics are high, but what is the human rights guidance and that? So if that's what you're doing, I think that's to complement. And of course, also looking at the supply chain is an important side, looking at your core business and others. So really looking at those two sides. I have 1-2 more requests for the floor, and then I'll come back to the panel. So please, yes. Yeah, sorry about the complications with the microphone.
I'll just stand because I'm sitting in the back so everybody can see me. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm Alice. I'm the Business and Human Rights Coordinator at Proactiva, so working with Rafael in our thermometer. And I wanted to bring up our experience in building this thermometer and how we the challenges also that we have when we're translating what we see in the UNGPs and in the OECD guidelines to a format of questions that can be easily understood by so many different companies of different sizes and in different sectors. So this, of course, was a lot of work that we put in this whole year. Julia is in the team, and also she also felt this. So the issue that I want to bring up is we definitely see the need for what Isabel was bringing up, of you having somehow homogenization and interpretation that stems from, for instance, OHCHR, right, on the application of the UNGPs. And at the same time, I see Jihad bringing up super important issues on the challenges of having a help desk that can answer to these questions. So I'm wondering, how could we bridge these two visions, right? What Isabel brought and what Gerald brought. And I'm asking, is the help desk the right structure for this, or would we need to somehow develop another kind of structure that could deal with these two sides? So this is my question, and I'm directing it to Jihad and Isabel, if we could somehow find a way forward in between. Thank you.
Thank you. That's actually a make question for the event. Nevertheless, before turning to the panel, I don't want to keep requests for the floor, so I'd like to give you a chance to speak, please.
Thank you so much, everyone, for these very inspiring interventions. I am Pedro Vilela, Head of Social Responsibility at Eletrobras. It's not Petrobras. Eletrobras is the other one, that is the electric utility company. I just like to add two quick comments. One is on what Tainá said, which is really, really important and true in itself, that we have this kind of bubble when we talk about human rights. Big companies are spearheading these discussions and so on. I would just like to add an extra complexity level on that, because even inside the big companies that are in the bubble, you have, again, two levels of bubbles. One is that the human rights discussion is still inside a bubble. And inside this bubble, you have an even smaller bubble where people actually understand that business and human rights are first and foremost about not doing bad, about dealing and addressing adverse impacts. And not only, which is also good in itself, advancing important constructive agenda in human rights as well. We can and should do that, but it's really important to turn the key. And if you don't have that inside and understand it that as an important ontological challenge to overcome, we won't be meaningful. Okay. And the other thing is that I really love what Gerald said, that we should broaden our views and think, even as companies, think about the three pillars. And as also he mentioned, capacity building in the three pillars and all the agents involved. And I would like to ask him if he could share with us as benchmark any initiative on that, like either a business-led initiative to build capacity in other agents, or some sort of alliance or coordinated action to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'll take this some more, and then we really have to come back to the panel. Otherwise, there's no waiting for the answer. Sorry,
Thanks so much. I'm Andrés Zaragoza. I work at International Service for Human Rights. It's an NGO that focuses on the protection and promotion of human rights defenders' work. I was actually checking the World Benchmarking Alliance score on Petrobras on several aspects. Not too good, but I haven't read in detail. But it's a very challenging discussion, and the implementation is even more challenging. My question and comment is, we manage the business network on civic freedoms and human rights defenders, which is a group of companies, global companies, talking about the role of defenders and the political environment in which companies operate. So it's not so much about the technical supply chain, but the political environment and the impact on defenders. That is yet another bubble. So I wonder, and my question is, are we getting too much into like the technical. Are we using the right words? Are companies understanding? Are we working enough to mainstream that knowledge internally in the company? What are the barriers? How can we help those that are working internally kind of promote these concepts internally? And to be honest, like Dante mentioned, do not depart from international standards, but there's so many international standards. Like, which ones shall we use to go to the companies to make them understand that they have responsibilities regarding human rights? Obviously, the guiding principles are kind of the reference point, but in my experience, it's hugely challenging for them to understand what we are talking about. And let alone when we talk about defenders and the potential risk that companies put them in. I don't know if you guys have experiences, those that in companies that we're talking before. So that would be great to hear.
Thank you. Yes, thank you very much for bringing the aspect and the focus on defenders actually also into our discussion. So yes, sometimes we get a lot of technicalities and need to see who we are talking about. Please, you for that intervention before we come back to it.
Thank you. I'm Camila Valverde from UN Global Compact. I'm responsible for the project area, the impact area in Global Compact. And congratulations for the panel in this discussion we are having here. What I want to say will be very quickly. I want to say something about regarding to what Pedro said about the bubble. We need to break this bubble with the companies that are doing and that right things about the human rights are in the follow. In one way is making this company working with their supply chain, their value chain. And when we work with big companies and they are really engaged to work with their value chain, we can break this bubble. So I think UN Global Compact are in the right way with the thermometer and the human strength, working with the big companies in Brazil. But also we need legislation to support human rights, business and human rights. And I think we are also in the right way. We are very, how can I say, esperançosos. We are hopeful that next year we're going to have a law in Brazil that will also working in human rights and business. And thank you everybody for coming. Thank you everybody to be in this fight together to defend the business, the human rights activists. When I see the necessity to protect the activists of human rights, we have a problem. So I think it's a fight for everyone here, in every place, in every conversation we have. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And yes, speaking of the development is also, I think, what Dante referred to when saying voluntary. Advance on the defender. We have about 1 minute per panelist, so I know it's more than challenging. Maybe you'll be indulgent if we go some very few minutes over. But with this, let me come back now also to the podium. We heard about implementation, creativity, the bubble, getting other companies benefit from those discussions. Lots of questions and comments. I'll let you address the ones you would want to address. Can I start with you going from this side of the table?
Yes, thank you, Felix. In 1 minute. I think that the questions and the responses were really interesting, helping us framing the debate. And I don't want to overcomplicate things, but we need to remember that the guiding principles were developed to respond to a global governance challenge. States are unwilling or unable to ensure respect for human rights. And the response was a multi-centric response. States, business, all actors of society. And I think it's extremely important that we keep that in mind in everything we design to foster respect for human rights. So multi-centric in the challenge, multi-centric in the response. It means we need to bring people together. And what I'm trying to say is, and bouncing back on what Lisiane said, we need to be careful because Helpdesk has a very, very clear connotation for the users, and maybe they are wrong, but that's what they understand. So they will be disappointed if they don't get what they think they should get. So we need to be careful. And likewise, the way the ambassador framed the question, and I have to welcome the very elegant way you describe the situation in your region. But that's we have this kind of question all the time from different stakeholders. Member states want to do good things. Who do they ask? Where do they go? So that's why we really, in my modest opinion, need to ensure capacity building, to ensure progress, a clear target, a clear desk that where people have a question, any kind of questions can go to. But to follow up on something that was said before, legitimacy is important, and we need to ensure norms legitimacy. But many actors are legitimate in this space. OHCHR most definitely, but the ILO as well, but the OECD as well, but UNDP as well, to go back to the UN family, and so on and so forth. UNICEF has done an amazing job on children's rights over the year, including with regard to business activities. So I think that what we need and what we need to focus our attention on in order to be able to respond to those questions is really a thing, something, and smart people will find a fancy name for it, that really foster change management and really bring together the key players to have this target when you have a question. People being together, and we let 1,000 flowers bloom, but we offer this kind of garden with the key players. And then sometimes it will be OHCHR, sometimes it will be a ILO, sometimes it will be whoever, states, business. But to have this place, this entity thing that brings together all the key players, so that we avoid, a nasty secret in the world of the UN is that everybody is fighting everybody else. So we should, let me finish, because it's
really,
it's a long minute, but it's an important point. If we want to move ahead, we need that thing that will allow us to go from local to global and back to local. So really, this entity bringing together players.
Thank you for the long minute, but your minutes go. This one over to you.
I think after working 10 years in IT, you say like 1 minute. I have 1 minute. So I think doing a resume first, I'm honored to have you, Ambassador, here. I think the solution is leaving our comfort zone and talking about outside of this bubble. So bringing this discussion to IT forums, CEO forums, to like doing this. And I see Global Compact is an important entity that could bring these bridges. So, and finally, always using technology to leverage the conversation. So using online solutions to connect Europe, Brazil, and using tools as translating. We will have a better tool. Sorry for saying that. That can translate into it. So all of you that are part of this discussion, please count on me on building together, because I believe in co-building, co-leading, and building sustainable solutions for all, everywhere.
Thank you very much. Rafael.
Maybe on investors' question, I think the fact we see the Brazilian investor asking this question maybe endorses already a very important point, which is how important is this moment here, right? And the milestone we're reaching, right? If we have an extremely experienced ambassador who is tackling so many multilateral matters, concerned on how this topic can mobilize in the right direction, this is already, I think, a victory for the mobilization part of what we were willing. So I think, Felix, we have to thank you for the opportunity putting together this occasion for us to exchange. I think we are a little piece in a massive effort that has years and years of history of mobilization. So I think we come very humbly here to share this practice we are bringing forward. But we believe this is, in the little piece we represent, this is a milestone in a certain measure for the business and human rights path. We have here a delegation of business, civil society under the umbrella of the UN Global Compact Network Brazil. We had two journalists mobilizing herself from Brazil to here to follow and cover the Forum on Business and Human Rights. I think this is unprecedented for Brazil. I don't know for how many countries that happened. So I think we have also to cheer our little victories, and I think we see this in this moment. And I think we really have to give kudos to the UN Global Compact Network Brazil, because right now and for a long time, human rights is not a sexy topic, right? It's not an appealing topic for corporations, right? And I think to come forward with a courage and in a project that, or whose first step is to recognize that we have gaps and that we have to improve, is really fantastic and inspiring. It's very easy to show the good side, right? But to progress is so. Again, thank you very much, and thank you all for the presence.
Thank you very much. And I also have to cut you to come to our next speaker, Rafael. Sorry for that, but Isabel, you also, I think there was the main question also of the day of how to get the two sides together of that multiplicity of questions and the authoritative guidance, if I don't use the word helpdesk directly, but speak of authoritative guidance. So also any question you would like to address in closing, Isabel, please.
Thanks, Felix. Yeah, definitely we can discuss whether the name is the right one. It's the one that has been used, so I'm using it for consistency. Just to say, I'm very happily building bridges, but I also never actually created a valley that needs a bridge. So I said earlier, there's two things that are on the roadmap. It's the help desk and it's the sort of hub and fund idea. And I do think these can coexist. The way I see it is that, we have reached a consensus of the UNGPs after a long consultation process. And we are in a sort of norms diffusion process at the current stage. So I don't think we have to open what we've agreed upon again and reach a new consensus, but rather stick to what has been agreed and try to not dilute that standard, but rather guarantee that quality. And hence, again, that idea of the OCHR as the guardian, as the one who has been sort of accompanying this process from the get-go. And then definitely it takes the polycentric governance approach. And hence we also see that mirrored in the roadmap, that there's this idea of the help desk. Again, the name might be changed and the mandate needs to be discussed. And then there's this idea of the hub and or the fund. So we have this spectrum of activities that can happen. And I am a full supporter of this ecosystem approach, where we need polycentric governance instruments. At the same time, we cannot dilute a consensus that was reached, and we need to make sure that this norm is diffused. There's sufficient other organizations that want to dilute the norm, so it's important that we're not sort of attacking the UNGPs from within the community.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Like Lisiane, you kept it to a short pitch. Thank you very much for that, both of you. Over to you, Taina, because it gives me the pleasure also to thank you with this for the cooperation, for bringing this event together. You might also want to address a number of those points. So over to you to close. Yeah. We started 10 minutes late, so if we end 10 minutes late, maybe that's acceptable to everyone. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Felix. And I also take the opportunity to thank you for your partnership. I think it's the first of, I hope it's the first of many. So I'll try to keep it up to the 1 minute, which is very challenging personally. But so I will go directly to the ambassador question. And I thank you for that, because I think it gives me the chance to wrap up everything that I wanted to say. Well, for us at the UN Global Compact in Brazil, I think now it's a very important moment, and we have like the wind in favor, maybe. But it's also key that we understand that business and human rights must be a priority. Better rephrasing it. There's no business and human rights without human rights. So the first thing, and to underwrite comment, we need the government to ensure that human rights defenders are protected, are working in a good environment for them to protect the rights of the ones that have been violated. And in Brazil, we have a history where we never had human rights, at least for most people. And I must say that we in this room have an representation of those that historically have not had and still don't have their rights assured. So that unbalanced gender configuration was totally intentional, which leads me to what we need from the government is intentionality. And this is what we need also from businesses. So I will say that we need to cooperate, we need to integrate, and we need to encourage businesses to understand that there is no business environment, positive business environment without human rights, without a democracy. And that needs to be always on top of mind of CEOs and also political leaders. So what we hope we can do with this innovative initiative and with the partnership we are building with all our companies, but specifically here with Petrobras in the UN Global Compact, is to normalize, like Dante also said, and take back human rights as a concept, because we cannot, how is the word in English? Sorry, no podemos abrir mão. We cannot leave them out. Yes, we cannot give up human rights to have SDGs or all the what we need to implement in our private sector environment. So I hope that the government can help us prioritize that, encourage businesses, and not only hope but count on it. And taking other points and the bubble and everything that we talked about, and I think these discussions here are super important for us to do this work of normalization, reappropriation, and give a new meaning to what human rights means. Because as we discussed in other forums this week, human rights means innovation, creativity, profit also, but to assure what we agreed in 1948 at the UN, that all people are born equally and need to have their rights assured. So I think that's the wrap up, and not 1 minute, sorry, but
thank you. Thank you so much, Tina. Yes, minutes are extensible. Sometimes time is relative. Thank you all so much for your participation in that. Thank you, Tina. Thank you to the Global Compact Network Brazil for the partnership. Thank you all the speakers for those very interesting, very insightful presentations.
You will kill me if I don't say we wanted to take a picture outside with everybody, so stay here.
That's a possibility for you here, not for those people online. Thank you very much. Thank you for having been here with us in that human rights conversation. Thank you for making positive use of the bubble, and also thank you in the future coming back to this bubble, continuing the discussions with us, how Geneva can actually also develop those standards and help also in that outreach that you're all talking about. Our human rights conversations will continue. Please also look for what's happening in our ongoing conversations. Come back to our discussions here. Thank you all very much. As mentioned, the Global Compact Network and ourselves will put this discussion online on our YouTube channel, so you'll have a chance to have a look at that. And I'm very much looking forward to continuing this discussion with all of you. And with this, I close the event and I let you go for a picture.
Thank you.